So in response to increasing evidence of war crimes, the United States is going to sanction Russia even more, including Vladimir Putin's daughters. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So the question increasingly on everybody's lips is, what will it take to finally get Vladimir Putin to back down from his illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine? It's become increasingly clear, by the way, that this is a pet project of Putin's, that this is not something that he got broad support from before he started it, or for which there was some outcry in Russia to get done. No, Putin views Ukraine, and truthfully all the former parts of the old Soviet Union that have broken away from Russia, as essentially prodigal children who need to be brought back into the fold. The Ukrainians, however, have other plans. They don't want to be part of Russia. They don't want to be part of a Soviet Union. They want to be their own country, as you would expect. In fact, you can understand the Ukrainians' wishes in that regard, especially if you know a little bit about the history of how Stalin, as head of the Soviet Union, which controlled Ukraine at the time, essentially starved the Ukrainians, resulting in the deaths of over 1 million people. The aim back then was genocide, to essentially get the Ukrainians out of the way to provide more living room for the Russian people and more resources for the Russians, given the fact that Ukraine does have a lot of natural resources and a very impressive agriculture sector. Putin, though, had so deluded himself into believing that the Ukrainians would be thrilled that their Russians had come to take their brothers back into the fold, that he reportedly has been outraged over the behavior of the Ukrainians, and has even fired some of his top officials who he feels did not give him accurate information about the level of the Ukrainian antipathy toward his actions. This level of anger and fury and frustration has clearly shown itself on the battlefields, and unfortunately in the towns that the Russians are trying to control. Not only have the Russians engaged in a vicious, aggressive invasion, attacking the Ukrainian military, as you would expect them to do under such circumstances, but when they've found the Ukrainian military harder to defeat than they expected, they've engaged in wholesale slaughter of civilians, including the bombing of a women's hospital, of a theater where children were cowering that was clearly marked that children were inside, and after agreeing to certain corridors that would allow people to escape the fighting, as women and children have been trying to flee the area, the Russians have then proceeded to shell them. So at this point, it's pretty hard to be shocked by the Russian behaviors. But you'd be underestimating Vladimir Putin and the Russians if you didn't believe they could do worse. What we now see in the suburbs around Kyiv, where the Russians are withdrawing so that they can mount a more aggressive, focused offensive just on the eastern part of Ukraine, we've found nothing short of genocide. We've seen bodies piled in the street with their hands tied behind their backs and shot in the head. Reports are that the Russians said these people they were killing were undesirable. And that's, after all, exactly what genocide is: killing off groups of people who you view as undesirable. Putin, for his part, of course, denies any of this and actually says that the Ukrainians are being aggressive in making these accusations, in that these dead bodies were actually people killed by the Ukrainians as part of a false flag operation to essentially blame the Russians. As absurd as that sounds, satellite imagery has proven that it is a blatant lie. Essentially, the New York Times was able to take satellite images of Bucha, the suburb of Ukraine where some of these massacres happened, and they saw pictures taken of the streets of Bucha with these bodies lying in the street exactly where they were when they were found when the Ukrainians arrived, while the Russians were still in control of the town. So in other words, any claim that this was done by the Ukrainians once they got there is a lie. This was done by the Russians when they were in control. Now, the framework that we have to address the issue of war crimes was developed after World War II, when we had the Nuremberg trials that attempted to hold the Nazis accountable for the horrors that they imposed upon the world. Coming out of that experience were what are called the Geneva Conventions, a series of rules that ban things like the intentional killing of civilians. Then, in 2002, the international community agreed on something called the Rome Statute that set up the International Criminal Court. In addition to the killing of civilians, these international rules have defined genocide as being the killing with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. So the key point of these rules is intent. I mean, it's clear that the Russians have been killing civilians, and it's increasingly clear that they are killing the Ukrainians as a group because they don't want to comply to the commands of His Highness Putin. But proving intent is difficult. You have to remember, intent is something you can't see or touch. It's something in the person's mind. So you need to be able to infer from the circumstances as to whether they intended to do something that they did. Well, increasingly it appears that evidence is mounting that Putin is intending to destroy the Ukrainian people and to commit a genocide. I mean, his argument has been that he stated publicly that the majority of Ukrainians are Nazis and that the goal of the invasion is denazification of Ukraine. According to Eugene Finkel, a Ukrainian-born political scientist and expert on genocide and mass violence, he claimed that these statements by Vladimir Putin amount to one of the most explicit statements of intent to destroy a national group as such as I've ever seen. At this point, it appears that there are increasing efforts to investigate the behavior of the Russians in Ukraine as war crimes and as genocide, for which its perpetrators, including Vladimir Putin, should be able to be held accountable. In fact, the Ukrainians allegedly have as many as 50,000 investigators across the country gathering evidence. France has also launched an investigation with respect to its jurisdiction, as has the International Criminal Court and the United Nations. But here's where we run into a problem. You see, such international bodies in and of themselves really have no power. They only have power to the extent that the nations involved are willing to submit to that power. It's not like the United States government, where if you live in Michigan, for example, and refuse to comply with direction from the United States government, that the FBI can come in or the military can come in and force you to comply. The ICC and the UN have no such ability to force nations to comply. What's more is they don't even have that with respect to member nations. But in the case of Ukraine and Russia, they're not even member nations of the International Criminal Court. So they don't even recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over their territories. Now, you might get all outraged about that, and as well you should be. I agree with that. But before we start pointing the finger too much, we have to remember the fact that the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court either. And that puts us in an awkward position of pointing the finger at Russia. So when Vladimir Putin says, oh, those Americans, how could they be so hypocritical? He's kind of got a point. We can't be criticizing other countries for invading sovereign nations when we did the same thing in Iraq on very flimsy evidence and flimsy claims to boot. In fact, there have been calls, for example, for George W. Bush to be held accountable for war crimes for taking us into Iraq, but yet that can never happen because of the fact that the United States is not a member of the ICC. The point of all this is, if we're going to be a moral leader in the world, we need to be blameless. We need to behave morally if we're then going to try to get other countries to behave morally as well. We need to follow the rules of the international order and not violate them, and support the institutions that enforce those rules if we're going to be out there advocating for other countries to behave that way as well. So in the short run, we're back to sanctions. And I actually think that there's something to be said for the latest round of sanctions. Vladimir Putin doesn't care about the people of his country. He doesn't care how much they suffer. He doesn't care about the people in his military, how much they suffer. I'm hoping, though, he does care about maybe his daughters. And when they're facing the fact that they lose access to their assets outside of Russia, well, maybe that'll make him think twice and realize that maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. Well, if you want to find out more about the sanctions that have been imposed against the Russians and the incredible leadership that President Biden has provided in that regard, check out this video over here. President Biden really deserves a lot of credit for playing such a leadership role. And in fact, the irony is he was probably the right person in place at the right time to be handling this crisis. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.